he referred to on the White House lawn. I think that they can have good vibes, they can have a nice appearance and optics. It's the meet and greet plus, it's the plus part. I think everybody is going to be looking to President Trump to get something of substance. And that doesn't mean a full deal. That means real clarity on the question of whether the North will, in fact, in a reasonable amount of time, give up in a verified way its nuclear weapons capability. Everybody's looking for that. If he does not get that, it's very hard to call it a success. And if he does get that, almost no matter what else happens, it will be a success.
Let me bring in Governor Richardson, and I want to play a clip for you from President Trump earlier this week that surprised a lot of people. Governor, here it is.
I think I'm very well prepared. I don't think I have to prepare very much. It's about attitude. It's about willingness to get things done.
Governor, is that what this summit is really about? The two men getting together face to face and sizing each other up, deciding whether or not they can do business. And we now hear talk that President Trump may, right at the start of the summit on Tuesday, pull Kim aside for a one-on-one before they meet with their full delegations. Would that be a good idea or not?
That would be a good idea because the North Koreans never make deals with counterparts across a negotiating table. They're very focused, relentless, they're very well prepared. But you make deals with them on the side. You know, I think that facility in Singapore is good for that. You take them for a walk or over a meal. I think the one-on-one is very important. The only caution I would give the president is not be photographed too much with a smiling Kim Jong-un, because they use that in North Korea for dramatic propaganda purposes. The North Koreans have already gotten one major concession, a meeting with the president. They're going to want a peace treaty, a security guarantee. I would wait on those until the North Koreans deliver some kind of verification, inspections, timelines. I think that's going to be very important.
Mr. Chang, you say, and I really following up on what Governor Richardson says, that North Korea has already gotten a lot of concessions, like the very fact that this summit is being held. What do you think Kim wants out of this day or so in Singapore?
Certainly Kim wants the photographs of him shaking hands with President Trump, because that's legitimization. And even more important, that means he solidifies his rule at home, because we're going to see those pictures of Trump and Kim for decades in North Korea. So, you know, President Trump gives up a lot of leverage as soon as he shakes hands with Kim, and that means if he doesn't get firm commitments to dismantle the weapons programs, then we're going to be working uphill. We can do that because we've got a lot of leverage, but it nonetheless puts Kim in the driver's seat, at least for a little while.
Governor Richardson, you have been to North Korea 8 times on various diplomatic missions. Back in 2005, you met with Kim's father, Kim Jong-il. What stands out about sitting across the table and negotiating with the North Koreans?
Well, first, they are very prepared. They know what they want. They never say no. You can drag on negotiations. They never tell you no. At the same time, they want that personal trust. They want to feel that you can deliver and you can negotiate with them. Kim Jong-un, I understand, is not like his father. His father was like a rug merchant. You know, you get a political prisoner, in exchange you get the visit of a former president. Kim Jong-un is not that way. I think he's more strategic. I think he wants private sector assistance for North Korea rather than what his father wanted, which was handouts and foreign aid. So I think we're dealing with a man that we probably have underestimated, and he's going to be very well prepared on some of these nuclear and missile issues. And I hope the president, and I worry sometimes that the president will not be as prepared.
Gentlemen, let's talk about some of the key issues that we think are going to come up in this summit. I want to begin with an acronym we're going to hear a lot about over the next few days, CVID, Complete, Verifiable, Irreversible Denuclearization. Here's how the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, defined that back in April. North Korea has to give up basically its whole program before the U.S. begins to relieve economic sanctions.
Yeah, relieving that pressure isn't going to make negotiation easier. It could make it harder.
Mr. Chang, do you think that Kim will ever give up his entire nuclear and missile programs? What's the most that we can hope for in that area?
Yeah, I think we could actually get CVID. This is not a Kim question, though. You know, Kim certainly doesn't want to give up his missiles, his nukes. He doesn't want to do any of that, of course. But this is an issue of what President Trump will do. Whether President Trump will use the elements of American power to force Kim to do what he doesn't want to do. So, for instance, we can tighten the sanctions on North Korea, because although the sanctions are strict, they're not strict enough. And we need to put sanctions on North Korea's major power backers, the Chinese and the Russians, who have been violating sanctions blatantly for the last 3 months. So clearly there's a lot that we can do. Now, we can do those things. It's a Trump question, though, Chris. It's not a Kim question.
I've got about a minute or so left, and I want to get to a couple of quick answers on other issues. Ambassador Gallucci, President Trump is also talking about an agreement between North and South Korea, in effect a peace treaty, and the conflict the armistice, rather, that began in the 1950s. And there's even talk that the president might offer normalization of relations in a U.S. embassy in Pyongyang. Are those good ideas? Are those good places to start? And if you begin there, isn't it going to be almost impossible to maintain the sanctions regime, the maximum pressure against North Korea?
Chris, this meeting is a cart before the horse, as everybody has noticed, with the president out front. You can also make the whole negotiation a cart before the horse. The normalization process, and the president referred to a process, should really be following the gains that we're looking to make at this summit and in the following meetings. So yes, ultimately having normalization of relations, exchange of liaison offices, exchange of embassies, all that is a good idea. But it should be done clearly in the course of a step-by-step phased movement in which we get what we need to get, and it means performance on the nuclear weapons, the nuclear program, production capability of fissile material, and their ballistic missile program. Taking the political part of that apart is to give the concession, the major concession that the North Koreans seek, something we should be willing to do eventually.
Governor, I got about 30 seconds. Quick question. If President Trump brings up human rights and the repression inside North Korea, how will that be received by Kim?
Well, he'll be nervous about it, but the president should bring those issues up, the Gulag issues in North Korea. The remains of our soldiers from the Korean War should be returned to their families. There's about 5,000 of those. Help the Japanese on the abduction issue. I think that's important. But I think if Kim is going to want modernization of his economy, a good trade-off is going to be a strong commitment of his improving the human rights situation in North Korea, which is pretty bad. The president should not leave human rights aside in this negotiation.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you all so much for participating this morning, and we'll see how the world turns this week. Up next, we'll talk with two American reporters who cover the White House and State Department and have made the long trip here. What do their sources say we should expect from the Singapore summit? When we come back with much more from Fox News Sunday, live in Singapore.
How long will it take to figure out whether or not they're serious? I said maybe in the first minute.
President Trump trusting in gut instinct on whether he'll be able to make a deal with Kim Jong-un at their historic summit that is now just hours away. We want to bring in two of the literally thousands of reporters who have come to Singapore to cover this historic event. David Nakamura, who reports from the White House for the Washington Post, and Fox News correspondent Rich Edson, who covers the State Department. Welcome, gentlemen. This is a kind of cool place to be, isn't it?
Not bad.
Well, I shouldn't say cool because the humidity and heat are off the charts, but it's a fascinating place. David, I want to start with you. And what strikes me as we approach the summit is how dramatically President Trump has lowered the expectations and his goals for this summit. Originally, there was talk about the complete denuclearization of North Korea. Now there's talk about a getting to know you process. Pretty substantial.
Very substantial. I think some of that, Chris, is due to what we saw leading up to the summit, which was that the president declared in March he was going to do this on a very fast time frame. He wanted to meet as soon as possible. He instructed his team to get to work. And then we saw some hiccups along the way, including the president, of course, backing out about 2 weeks ago of the summit. I think that showed that the negotiations were hitting a bit of a roadblock, and that's not unexpected. People who've negotiated with North Koreans in the past have said they're very difficult to nail down ahead of these summits, and you have a very condensed time frame. So the president is readjusting. Some of that's due, I think, to what he was hearing from his negotiating team on the ground in Korea. I think they had at least 5 different sessions trying to nail down what is going to take place at the summit, and the White House has still not said what that is. We do know the president has talked about this meet and greet tomorrow, and he's really stressed the historic nature of some Tuesday. Really stressed the historic nature of that. I think to say, look, just the meeting is a big deal, but as some of your guests have talked about, that's not nearly a big deal enough.
Nothing, it seems to me, Rich, defines the split inside the administration more than 2 people. First, National Security Advisor John Bolton, who originally said when this meeting was first announced, here's the meeting should be. President Trump should meet with Kim and say, when are you going to deliver all of your nukes and all of your missiles in the next week? I mean, he was like, you deliver, and then we'll talk about what we may give. And then you've got the new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who seems to have taken a much longer view of this whole process. I guess the question is, how dramatic a split is there inside the president's foreign policy team?
It's significant, but it's the type of split that you have a national security advisor who went through some of this during the Bush administration, and there was from 1994 to 2002 an agreement in place between the United States and North Korea where there were inspectors living inside North Korea. They did destroy nuclear infrastructure, and that didn't hold. And now you have a Secretary of State who comes into the 21st century in the Trump administration, who is the most senior person in the last 18 years to have met with Kim Jong-un or to meet with North Korean leadership, to meet with the dictator of North Korea. He's been there twice. We asked the Secretary of State directly what his impression of Kim was, and he was, I wouldn't want to say complimentary, but he certainly wouldn't say anything very bad about the conversation that he had with him when he went to North Korea.
I'll tell you 2 things he told me off camera. I guess I can say it. One is he said he is very well prepared, very well versed. And I said, do you think he understands English? Because the conversation was all being translated, and he said, I had the distinct impression as I was making my point, he understood the point I was making and took the time for the translation to figure out his response.
Yeah, the question if he really understands what he's saying, he's really waiting for the translation. Sometimes they put that show on in front of translators. But the key thing that the Secretary of State has said going into this is that it would be a true tragedy if Kim Jong-un didn't take advantage. He was essentially saying that it's the North Koreans who have to move here, but unlike the National Security Advisor, it seems as though he wants to give them that opportunity and that leeway.
What's interesting is you do see that John Bolton has made this trip and he's going to be part of it. We saw him sidelined a bit a week ago or so when a North Korean official visited the White House. John Bolton was not in those meetings because the North Koreans have a very hostile.
Do you think he will sit down in the meeting?
We think that he's involved in parts of the meeting at least.
Because, I mean, I think it's fair to say the North Koreans just plain don't like him, right?
They have used very hostile language about John Bolton. They've stayed away from doing that with Donald Trump, but certainly there's a lot of hard feelings from the Bush days when John Bolton advocated for repeal.
I suspect John Bolton would consider that a badge of honor. David, you know, the president has said from the start and said again this weekend in Canada, look, if this meeting is a waste of time, I am going to walk out. Do you think that there are any circumstances under which he would walk out, or given that probably at the very least there is going to be the optics of the 2 men meeting and talking, that he will declare the Singapore summit a success regardless?
I think some of these things tend to be baked in ahead of time. There's a lot of groundwork that led up to this. It was a rushed process, but I think the president really wants us to be a success. He sees a political victory here. He's done something his predecessors have not done: start this process, start a meeting. As you said, he's lowered expectations, but I see very unlikely the president gets up and walks out. Even if we don't see a sort of a grand bargain in the end of this, which no one expects to happen, I think it's the start of a process. The president himself now has said it could take more meetings between the two leaders and certainly the staff to nail down some of the details.
Yeah, your man, Mike Pompeo at the State Department, has obviously been the leader in terms of negotiating with the North Koreans, Kim, and then also his vice chairman. Mm-hmm. What's the sense that you're getting from your sources about how this process plays out after Singapore? Is it a long process? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about years? Are we talking about multiple summits? What's your sense of the process here?
Multiple summits and continued conversations. And remember, the United States and North Korea, under the Trump administration, have already had conversations going back to when Otto Warmbier was returned to the United States. There has been a channel in New York at the United Nations. So a lot of those conversations have taken place even before Secretary of State Mike Pompeo took over at the State Department. And remember, as CIA director, he has been to North Korea, and as Secretary of State, he has been there. But I think now you're even hearing the president publicly acknowledge, because I think of the results that you're hearing from the conversations with State Department officials, that this is going to take more than one meeting, a high-level meeting, also with the continued conversations at the staff level to try to get this done. There are major issues that they have to work through here to have a successful agreement.
All right. Having said all of that, David, how invested is President Trump in this negotiation with Kim? You know, in the early heady days right after the announcement of the summit, the president was thoroughly enjoying the crowds chanting Nobel Peace Prize. Clearly, things have calmed down a little bit from that point, but how badly does he want a deal, and is there a danger that he could fall exactly into the trap that Barack Obama, he says, fell into with Iran, that he pushes for a deal even if it's not the right deal?
Right, that is a danger, and it could be a deal very similar to what we saw with Iran, an extended period of time, and one that North Korea could get some economic benefits down the road. I think how invested he is, he's extremely invested. If you look around the world with his foreign policy, he's alienated allies, as we know. We saw what happened at the G7. He's sort of tangling now with Iran again, raising stakes there. This is the place where he's trying to use diplomatic means to achieve something. I think it's a real important moment for him.
David, Rich, thank you both. Thank you both for joining us. Let's hope for lots of news this week.
Yeah.
Before President Trump flew here to meet with a longtime enemy, as David said, he first confronted U.S. allies over tariffs at the G7 Economic Summit in Canada. We'll discuss where things stand now on that issue with White House trade advisor Peter Navarro as Fox News Sunday continues live from Singapore. A look at the striking Marina Bay Sands Hotel here in Singapore with its iconic sky park at the top there ahead of Tuesday's landmark summit. Before President Trump traveled to Asia, he faced other world leaders at the Group of Seven Economic Summit in Canada, allies that are upset over new tariffs he's imposed on steel and aluminum imports. Joining us now, one of the architects of that controversial plan, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro. Mr. Navarro, the summit ended with a nasty dust-up between President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. He held a news conference after the summit in which he said Canada will retaliate for tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel. Here is Trudeau.
We move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
Well, President Trump responded with this tweet while flying here on Air Force One to Singapore. Trudeau of Canada acted as so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left. Very dishonest and weak. Question, Mr. Navarro, is that really how we want to deal with our second biggest trading partner?
Chris, there's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did. And that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history. All Justin Trudeau had to do was take the win. President Trump did the courtesy to Justin Trudeau to travel up to Quebec for that summit. He had other things, bigger things on his plate in Singapore, where you are now, Chris. He did him a favor, and he was even willing to sign that socialist communique. And what did Trudeau do as soon as the plane took off from Canadian airspace? Trudeau stuck our president in the back. That will not stand. And as far as this retaliation goes, the American press needs to do a much better job of what the Canadians are getting ready to do, because it's nothing short of an attack on our political system, and it's nothing short of Canada trying to raise its high protectionist barriers even higher on things like maple syrup and other goods.
Mr. Navarro, I got a lot to talk to you about, but I do have to press this. You used some very strong words. Stab in the back, special place in hell. You said that came from Air Force One. Are those the views? Are those the words of the president?
Those are my words, but they're the sentiment that was on Air Force One after that. Look, Chris, this was just wrong what Trudeau was doing. The Canadians are totally bungling our trade relationships, and it's due to their leadership. Take NAFTA, for example. We'd have a deal. We'd have a great deal with NAFTA by now if the Canadians would spend more time at the bargaining table and less time lobbying Capitol Hill and our press and state governments here. They are just simply not playing fair, dishonest, weak.
Well, I want to pick up on this, though, Mr. Navarro, because it isn't just Canada. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, released a photo of the summit, and there was no comment on it, but it certainly looked like it was President Trump against the other members of the G6, America's closest allies. And I want to pick up on this point, because the last time you were on with me on Fox News Sunday, you said that no country would retaliate for the tariffs that we're going to impose. But let's take a look at, in fact, what has happened since we last talked. Canada has announced tariffs on $13 billion in U.S. goods. The European Union will impose tariffs on $3 billion in American products. I understand, sir, that the objective of the president's trade policy, with your advice, some would call it a trade war, is to get the other countries to lower their tariffs on us, but hasn't the practical effect been to get them to raise their tariffs on our products?
So one of my favorite quotes of this president happened just yesterday when he said, "We've been the piggy bank for the world, and that's got to stop." If you look at Angela Merkel's Europe, you see a continent where we run a $151 billion trade deficit in goods every year. Germany has tariffs on autos 4 times higher than our tariffs on equivalent German imports here, and they sell us 3 times as many cars as we sell them. So on the issue alone, we have allies strategically, but when it comes to these trade disputes, these allies basically are robbing us blind. The president is not going to put up with that. And in terms of this retaliation, I want to get back to the Canadian miscalculation here. The Canadians, because this is retaliation.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to move on because we've got limited time, and I've got some other questions. Because the president also shocked the allies just before he came to Canada by suggesting, pushing the idea that Russia should be invited back into the G7 to make it the G8, the meeting, the group of economic world leaders. Here's the president on that.
It may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run. And in the G7, which used to be the G8, they threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in.
But, Mr. Navarro, Russia was kicked out of the G8 after it invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea. why does the president think they should in effect be rewarded when they haven't done anything to clean up their action? They're still in Crimea, by welcoming them back into the G8.
Chris, let me say a couple of things here. First of all, that one's above my pay grade. Ambassador Bolton, Mike Pompeo, the president himself deal with issues like that. But just observationally, I mean, look what's happening now in Singapore. The president is willing to talk to Kim Jong-un in the hope that we can deal with denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. He's willing to talk with any world leader, and I think the philosophy here is that when we have discussions with world leaders, we should get everybody together so that we can basically hammer some of these problems out. So I think that the bigger problem here, from my point of view, I'm the trade guy, is that we have a bunch of countries out there, whether it's strategic competitors like China or allies like Europe and Canada, basically using us as a piggy bank, using unfair trade practices. And my job at the White House is to help the president get jobs, good jobs, manufacturing jobs for the working men and women of America. And we can't do that unless we upset this existing world order, which basically is tremendously biased. We lose $500 billion a year of our wealth every single year because of these unfair trade practices. And that's what the president's standing up for.
Mr. Navarro, let's go back to a trade issue then. You are a notorious hardliner on China and the unfair trade practices there. Well, you wrote a book a few years ago called Death by China. So here's my question.
My code name at the CIA is Notorious, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay, that's interesting.
No, it's a joke, Chris.
How do you explain the decision by President Trump to lift the sanctions against the Chinese telecom company ZTE after it had violated our sanctions, our ban on doing business with North Korea and Iran, and was considered to be a serious national security risk? Why on earth would we do that?
I think you should have Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross on to explain the details of what is a very hard negotiation that was done. But I can tell you this, it's going to be 3 strikes you're out on ZTE. If they do one more additional thing, they will be shut down. We have a bad actor in ZTE. The president did this as a personal favor to the president of China as a way of showing some goodwill for bigger efforts such as the one here in Singapore. But it will be 3 strikes you're out for ZTE, and everybody understands that within this administration. So they're on notice. We're going to have monitors inside that company. They're changing their board of directors. They're changing their management, and they're paying us $1.5 billion in order to continue in business.
I want you to give me a 1-sentence answer on my final question.
Okay, I'll try.
Did the ZTE decision give you some heartburn?
I don't get heartburn. Justin Trudeau tried to give me heartburn.
I'll have to think of another physical. I'll have to think of another physical diagnosis. Mr. Navarro, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Always good to talk with you, sir.
My pleasure. Good luck in Singapore, Chris.
Thank you. Up next, President Trump's surprising call to bring Russia back into the economic group of world leaders. We'll discuss that and more with our Sunday group back in D.C. as Fox News Sunday reports ahead of the U.S.-North Korea summit live in Singapore.
Smiling at me, you know, it's like the gig is up. It's like the gig is up. They're not trying to, there's nothing they can say. They can't believe they got away with it.
President Trump at the G7 summit in Canada describing the reaction of U.S. allies to his tough new trade policy. And it's time now for our Sunday group back in Washington. Former Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz, Adrian Elrod, former advisor to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Jonah Goldberg of the National Review. Jonah, let me start with you. Your thoughts about the optics and the substance of the G7 summit in Canada, and especially those explosive words we just heard from Peter Navarro that clearly was on like a direct message from President Trump on Air Force One.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on all things theological, but I'm pretty sure your admittance to hell is not entirely contingent upon your attitude towards Donald Trump or whether or not you agree with his trade policies. So I'm not sure there's a special place in hell for Trudeau. And I thought that was more than a little over the top. As I thought Donald Trump's entire performance in Canada. I understand that he likes this optics. It works for him domestically with his base to sort of be seen as standing up to the globalist world order and whatnot. But these are our closest allies. He's saying that, you know, he's legally justifying these tariffs and on the grounds that it's a national security issue. But when he's pressed on it a little bit, all of a sudden he says, no, it's really because of dairy subsidies in Canada. And I think that's going to create real policy problems for him going forward.
Adrian, Democrats generally like the idea of protections to help U.S. workers and U.S. industries. So from the Democratic point of view, with this new tough trade policy and talk of tariffs, is President Trump on the right track?
No, absolutely not, Chris. I mean, look, Democrats are all for protecting U.S. workers, but at the same time, we recognize that getting into a trade war with some of our biggest allies, notably Canada and Germany in this situation, is not the right course of action for our workers. This is what the president has done from the very beginning. We know that he did not consult with his full team of economic advisors before he imposed tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum. And we're seeing him display this erratic, chaotic type of behavior with some of our closest allies. That is not a way to help American workers.
Congressman Chaffetz, you want to respond to that?
No, look, the president was elected to do something other than the status quo, and his disruption was certainly very successful in that summit. That's what he was elected to do. That's what he's doing. And I think from his approach, that puts the United States in a position to now go back and push some negotiations so that we can get to something that is fair and balanced and equal. I think that's what the president is after, and I think that's where we'll eventually get to.
But Congressman Chaffetz, President Trump keeps saying, and Peter Navarro says, that, look, the point of all this, and that eventually our allies and countries like China will cave and lower their trade barriers. But the results, at least so far, and I understand it's early, is that instead of lowering their trade barriers in response to our threats, they're raising their tariffs. I mean, can't you make the argument that instead of solving the problem, we're creating a trade war?
I think the president is after the long-term goal of making sure that there's an equalization that happens across our borders. We love Canada. We love Germany. These are our allies. But it is not fair. And the people within those industries who want to export to those countries know how imbalanced it is. And that's why Donald Trump enjoys so much support from those people in those industries. And I think this will accelerate the need to, now that there's a problem, to go back, and it's been highlighted by the president, to go back and solve that. And I think he will.
Jonah, as a traditional conservative free trader, do you buy that?
No, not at all. Sorry, with all due respect. I think that all of this is premised on a lot of economic fallacies, which can be illustrated just starting with the fact that President Trump loves to talk about how terrible trade deficits are while he's bragging about how much foreign investment that we are getting. Foreign investment is the inverse of trade deficits because all of those dollars have to come back to America somehow. The bigger your trade deficits, the more foreign investment you get. This is all premised on an accounting fiction that somehow trade deficits are terrible. Meanwhile, the things that we're putting tariffs on are much more important to industries in America that use them. We use a lot of steel. When we make steel more expensive, we hurt more workers and cost more jobs than we save. This is a blinkered 1930s approach to economic policy, and it makes no sense whatsoever.
I've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to get to one other subject. Adrian, what do you make of President Trump's surprising call to bring Russia back into the economic summit, to make the G7 the G8?
You know, Chris, the fact that he is, again, alienating some of our top, closest, longtime allies, but he seems to continue to embrace Russia and, frankly, North Korea. I don't understand it. I don't know what Vladimir Putin has on him, but it's absolutely ridiculous to even insinuate, given all of the international rules that Russia has violated, most notably going into Crimea, that he would even invite them back into to make it the G8 again. It's ludicrous. It makes you, again, wonder what really does Vladimir Putin have on Donald Trump to make him do this.
Congressman Chaffetz, I know you're not going to like that association, but it is one that people are certainly going to raise, and it is, I think you'd agree, at least from a political standpoint, it is an odd suggestion to make, to invite Russia back in right in the middle of the Russia investigation in the United States?
I see nothing in Russia's behavior that would justify bringing them back in to make them part and make it back to the G8. I just don't see that. The invasion of Crimea, the attack on our financial systems, the meddling in an election, the stealing of our intellectual property. I mean, there's nothing on that checklist that would say, hey, this is a good idea, Russia's now behaving better, let's bring them back in as a partner in these discussions and make it the G8. I don't get it.
So let me ask you, as one of our political analysts, why do you think he's doing it?
I don't know. I don't know. The president had a mission to disrupt the current status quo with the G7 and get after some of these trade imbalances. But I think that was a distraction to suddenly suggest that Russia should be part of those discussions. It just came from out of the blue. I don't understand it.
30 seconds, Jonah. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy this is all because Putin has something on Trump explanation. I think it may, in fact, be because President Trump tends to like to pick on people he thinks he can get away with picking on, and he sees the G7 and people like Trudeau as pushovers, and meanwhile he tends to respect countries and strong leaders that don't like democracy and behave in a sort of authoritarian way. And I think he kind of likes Xi of China, Kim, and Putin because they exert a kind of manfulness.
All right. Anyway, it's something to talk about. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday back in D.C. Up next, what we can learn about the Trump-Kim summit from summits of the past. Showmanship and substance and sometimes agreements that changed the course of history. The excitement over the Trump-Kim summit harkens back to an earlier time, 30 or 40 years ago, when the leaders of the two great superpowers would get together with the world's fate hanging in the balance. For sheer drama and long-term significance, nothing rivals the talks between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And I was fortunate to have a front row seat. When Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva in November of 1985, it was the first summit between leaders of the U.S. and Soviet Union in 6 years. And this first encounter of a lifelong Cold Warrior and a vigorous, business-like Russian drew the world's attention. A young White House reporter was there.
Certainly no major breakthrough, and we certainly don't expect anything like that at all. But, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in these 2 days of talks. That's going to be the telling sign, and that's what we're told by U.S. officials, that one of the keys to this whole summit will be how these two men get on during the 12 hours they'll be spending together.
There were no breakthroughs, but the two leaders decided they could do business. 11 months later, they held a snap summit in Reykjavik, Iceland. Gorbachev offered massive arms cuts, but only if Reagan gave up his Star Wars missile defense plan. Reagan refused and walked out. U.S.-Russian relations went into the deep freeze, but the deadlock in Iceland led to deals a year later. They signed a historic agreement to eliminate all medium-range missiles in Europe, although Star Wars still blocked a deal on long-range weapons.
The General Secretary and I expressed different points of view. We did so bluntly. And for that reason alone, our talks have been useful in this area.
It seems clear, then, that Gorbachev is ready to deal with the U.S., but only on his own terms and at his own pace. For a president with just a year left in office, that may mean steady progress, but not the big finish he hoped for. But there was a big finish in Moscow in May of 1988. Walking through Red Square with Gorbachev, Reagan was asked whether he still thought Russia was an evil empire.
No, I was talking about another time, another era.
Again, there was no deal on the ICBMs the two superpowers aimed at each other. But Reagan spent time pushing for human rights in Russia, setting the stage for future change. As U.S. officials become increasingly certain there will be no big agreements here, they are playing up the president's contact with the Soviet people, saying it will be great theater and could mark something of a turning point in superpower relations. That turning point came in November of 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and Eastern Europe was set free. 2 years later, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. We can only hope the diplomacy of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un brings change that's as long-lasting. For full coverage of the Trump-Kim summit, please stay tuned.